Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and you are in for the Uber double triple treat today because I'm in for the Uber double triple treat as we have Arielle Nissenblatt to visit with us about what she has going on. I was trying to think of when I first met you. It was sometime pre-pandemic when you started working with the Squadcast guys writing a newsletter and followed your career since then. You've got some great things going on. So with that incredibly long-winded introduction, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Okay, first of all, Uber double triple is really fun. I have not heard that phrase before. Second, visit with us is so Texas, and I'm very happy to do it.
I had a guy tell me that about 15 years ago. He said, "Nobody says that on a podcast. You're such a
I
Texan."
love it. I love it. I'm visiting
So
with
yeah,
you.
we
It's the
just
best.
yeah, it's just as my wife would say a nit-nat. I would probably formalize that into a chit-chat, but yeah. I'm not even quite sure where to begin with your background in podcasting, but could you give our listeners a sense of the Arielle journey?
Sure. Yes. I am a person who loves listening to podcasts. And I'd love to start with that first because it is what prompted me to do everything that I've done in my career. That's important to me. I had a tiny bit of a career before podcasting. I worked for nonprofits in Jackson, Mississippi, actually, which is where I got exposed to terms like visit with us. So I had that job for a bit, moved to Los Angeles after that. No visiting with people there. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's very, very tough there. People are very different from the South. I've lived in a bunch of places, actually. I've lived also in St. Louis, also in Portland, Maine, and now I'm in Brooklyn, New York. And I have, since the Los Angeles Times, been working in the podcast space. Like I said, first starting as a listener, I started a podcast recommendation newsletter in 2017 that allowed me to start having conversations with people who were making the shows that I loved. It was kind of just an excuse for me to get to have meetings with people, get to have coffee with people, and to ask them how they got jobs in the podcast space. Initially, I wanted to do whatever it took to work for any sort of podcast company. I would have done like front desk work. I would have done booking. I would have done production. I would have done anything just to get my foot in the door at a podcast company, whether it was production or business or anything. And so while I was trying to figure that out, I was writing this newsletter and on the side doing social media for people and doing marketing for a few companies and for individual clients and things like that. And in 2017, so later in the year in 2017, after I started this newsletter, I had been going to a lot of co-working spaces for meetings with podcast people and with other media folks around Los Angeles. And I wanted to work in a co-working space so badly. I wanted to have a desk there because I thought they were so cool. This is before WeWork completely imploded. But I shared the idea of what if I built a podcast studio in a co-working space in Los Angeles, and I shared that with a few co-working spaces, and a few of those places got back to me. One was particularly interested, so I started building a podcast studio in a co-working space. I had no idea what I was doing, not a clue, but I did it. I did that for about a year and a half, and then from there, I went on to work at Castbox, which is a podcast listening app. And then after about a year, I moved to Squadcast, the remote recording app. I was there for about 4.5 years. They were acquired by Descript in 2023. And then I was at Descript for a year and a half. So 4.5 years total. Yes, at between Squadcast and Descript. And as of the past few months, I've been working at Audily, which is a production company. And I specifically head up the Pinwheel division, which is the chat casts. And all throughout, I've been writing this newsletter that I mentioned before. And I really love to be involved in growing the podcast space. So not just helping individual creators grow their podcasts, but also helping spread the word podcast to more people and just getting more people to listen to podcasts in general. That's one of my missions in life. And I do a few other things. I'm involved in the board of governors for the Podcast Academy. I judge several awards, podcast related awards. I love to speak at conferences and things like that. And I'm sure we can get into some of it, but that's the gist. And it was 4 minutes long. So for that, I apologize.
No worries at all. I was wondering if we might start with your assessment of the podcast scene domestically versus internationally, because I know you've had the opportunity to travel internationally? Is there the enthusiasm and response to podcasts outside the United States that we see here inside the United States?
There is, but it's different. It depends where. So I once spoke at a conference in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and this was in 2022. So it was still coming out of the pandemic. People were still wearing masks at all over. But what I found is that radio is still very big there. There are definitely some radio personalities that are now putting out their content also via an RSS feed, via podcast. They're gaining a following via Apple or Spotify, but also they have shows on the radio and people are tuning into that. However, just anecdotally, when I was in Malaysia, I went on an Airbnb experience hike to some waterfall, like 40 minutes outside of Kuala Lumpur. And my tour guide loved podcasts, and he still follows me on Instagram to get podcast recommendations. So just a tiny bit of fun little anecdote. So that's what I found to be there, is that radio is still huge. I don't know how that's changed in the past few years. In Europe, there are a lot of podcast companies. I've spent a lot of time in the German speaking world, and I've met a lot of German podcast entrepreneurs, mostly studio owners or agency owners. And they have a lot of business, whether it's working with bigger publications in order to make their podcast. I forget what it's called. There's a newspaper. There's a bunch of newspapers in Germany. One of them in particular has several podcasts. And they also have a bunch of public radio related stations that are similar to the systems that we have in the US, but not entirely similar. And they also have podcasts, whether it's chat shows or even just deeper dives into the news. What I have found, though, is that the ad market is behind the US. And while it does exist, it is definitely less prevalent. And you can tell by when you're there and you press play on a podcast, there are fewer ads programmatically inserted. And there are also fewer host-read ads, which means that companies are not necessarily hitting up the companies that are making podcasts to say, we'd love to be represented by the shows in your network yet. But it's still happening, but it's definitely not as prevalent as it is in the US. So those are some of the differences. When it comes to listening, people are listening to podcasts for sure. I would say there is still always going to be the question of, oh yeah, I've heard of podcasts, but like, how do I get that? But that still happens in the US too. So I'm not totally sold on that being a non-US thing. I think it's everywhere. For a while, technology takes a while to adapt or to be adopted.
So could you tell us a little bit about your work at Audily and how that supports two things? One, your passion for all things podcasting, and number two, podcasters as well.
Yes. So I started working at Audily in December. Audily is a very cool company that it's an umbrella company. Under Audily, there are a few more companies. So one is Event Liftoff, which does live events for podcasters. There's Rococo Punch, which is a podcast production company that does long form investigative short series, things like that. Long form, but short, like limited series. Then there is also Pop Up, which is a kids content production company. So they do music, but also podcasts for kids, other things for kids. They work with larger brands and organizations on content for kids. And they've really figured out how to engage Gen Alpha, I think, at this point. Then Pinwheel, which is what I mentioned, I am now heading up. Pinwheel is the Chatcast / interview division / B2B podcast production side of things. So I chat with a lot of thought leaders about whether or not they should have podcasts and what that podcast could look like. I also speak with a lot of like nonprofit organizations about what it would look like to engage their target demographics if they were to have a show. And then I put those shows together with them and then show run those shows. But it's also very early days at this point. So we're still figuring out the footprint that we want to have. And I imagine some types of shows will be more involved in the day-to-day than others. But I'm really finding is that a lot of people feel like they need to be making something for their audiences or for the people that they want to be their audiences, but they don't know what they should be making. And we can help with that, whether it's a straight up podcast or a podcast with a video component or a podcast with clips that are taken out and posted on LinkedIn. And I think that is, as of now, where things are going in general is we just want to be making stuff that is high value that we can then translate to a lot of different mediums to potentially hit the people that we want to be seeing our stuff. Does that make sense?
Not only does it make sense, but I'm actually feeling something I never feel on podcasts, which is I'm extraordinarily jealous of
Oh,
what you got going on. That just sounds like one of the greatest job descriptions I've ever heard.
it's fun. I'm really definitely given a lot of freedom to figure out what needs to get done, which is really cool. So yeah, there's the passion element. I find after working, I've been in the workforce for 11 years, and I find that I respond differently, of course, to different types of bosses, different types of physical work environments. And I really thrive when I am able to figure out who I need to be talking to, going to have a coffee with them, going to have a virtual chat with them, and taking my learnings from that and applying it to what I do. And sometimes there's a direct application, and other times it takes a while. For example, in 2017, when I started a podcast studio at a co working space, somebody found that co working space on the internet and came in, and I had a chat with him, and we stayed in touch on LinkedIn, and just last week, I had a call with him and I'm going to make a podcast for him. It takes a long time, but it happens. And that is the proof that who knows if it's going to be like financially, if those are all the things that are going to work out financially, but it's still really cool to see some things come together so many years later. And clearly, the thing that strung it along was just being involved, being active on LinkedIn, being a person who loves podcasts very loudly.
I podcast in a very niche arena, legal and regulatory compliance. So I've been able to focus my marketing efforts on companies in that space who want to talk to their target audience. But how do you help someone who has perhaps a more general podcast or a more general business focus on getting not simply to their target audience, but then flipping that to a sponsor, advertiser, or other who wants to talk to their audience?
Yeah. That's a good question. I'm trying to think of examples without giving away too much information, so I will make something up that is close to reality. First of all, I think that a lot of branded brands that enter into the podcast space don't necessarily need to take on sponsors in order for their show to be effective. Of course, if they want to make money, that's a different story, but I would probably not frame that as sponsorship, and I would more so frame it as partnerships and things like that. Maybe they are partnering with other peer organizations or people that are vendors within their organizations rather than taking on a straight up sponsor where there's like a code at the end of the ad read, because then you're first of all asking your listeners to listen to a branded show where you're promoting your own thing, and then you're also telling them about something else entirely. That's not, of course, the case for everything, and it's also very dependent on the type of show that you're making, whether it's a straight up chat show or if it's something a little bit more deep dive, research based, investigative. Um, okay, say I have a friend who has a real estate podcast, and it's very specific about real estate. It's not just real estate, it's about technology within real estate. And the people that he talks to on the show and the people that sponsor are often the same people, but sometimes the way that goes is that he talks to the people on the show because he's genuinely interested in what they do, and then down the line they're interested in getting in front of that audience as well. So I think it's really about the slow build of creating these partnerships and over time showing them the value of a podcast, and the fact that especially with a business related podcast, LinkedIn is another great place to be. And if you can make content for LinkedIn, video clips that come from the podcast, but also blog posts that come from the content that we spoke within the podcast, there's just so many ways to repurpose that and make sure that you're constantly hitting your target audience with really thoughtful, high value pieces of information that can then also benefit an advertiser to get in on as well.
I really liked what you just mentioned on the video clips, and you mentioned blogs. You mentioned that a little bit earlier on a wider series of social media sharing platforms. Do businesses understand, or do you have to have conversations around that once you record, you can create and recreate content literally at will, and the power of having that social media content creation going forward?
I don't think it really depends who is kind of at the helm of the marketing strategy. And also, it really depends on the quality of the content that you're making. I If we're recording this podcast and we're able to get really great audio from this, maybe a few really great video clips from it, that's awesome. But I don't have a professional background right now. If we're recording video, I don't even know if we're recording video, but I made sure that it was at least clear in the background and it's not too distracting. But a lot of people don't have great internet connections, so it's going to seem pixely. The internet connection might be off. There might be latency issues with the recording. So a lot of times that is a factor that comes into play when we're thinking about working with brands that want to be making content or want to be creating clips and other things that, like I said, are genuinely useful for their target demographics. But if they are able to at least in advance say something like, okay, by the end of this by the end of this recording, and I'm not even going to say episode because it doesn't necessarily need to be made specifically for an episode of a podcast. By the end of this recording, I want to have one 60-second soundbite where my guest really sounds like a pro in what they're a pro at. I want to have one 30-second soundbite where I sound like a pro in what I'm a pro at. And I want to have two 30-second video clips where the two of us kind of have a fun back and forth banter. We're just going back and forth and it's fun and it's cute because that would look good on LinkedIn to show that our two brands are interacting well together or that there's opportunities for collaboration. And I think if people can start understanding that it doesn't need to be perfect, but it should be prescribed, essentially, that if you don't naturally get those 60-second, 30-second clips, maybe at the end you say, hey, before we go, let's just make sure we get that. What are you really comfortable speaking about? And then the two of us can manufacture that. And I think a lot of brands don't know that you can get that specific with the sessions that you're having.
So how do you assess I do interview podcasts in the B2B world. That's very different than a true crime or other historical event podcast. It may be very different than the children's podcast you work on. How do you help someone understand the different types of strategies they need to do, not in bringing it to market or even recording, but in the pre-recording preparation?
This is going to sound like a cop out, but I always ask people if they listen to podcasts first. And if they don't, I give them homework to listen to podcasts and to find a favorite podcast and then to tell me what the format of that podcast is. And I really think that half the battle is won if you are a consumer of the craft that you are now going to be a creator within. So if somebody takes the only reason I can speak on podcasts at all and speak in front of audiences at all is because I'm a really good mimic. And I think a lot of people function that way to an extent. You hear something, you can over time emulate what you like about it and get rid of what you don't like about it. You see something, you mimic that action if you are even if you're being recorded via video. And I really do to ask people to at least have some familiarity in the space that they are looking to enter. If I can't do that, then it's still doable. I try to explain you can have a straight up chat show. You can have a chat show where it's not a chat show, but maybe it's an interview show where you record with a guest, but then at the end we strip your audio and we just make it narrative with your narration popping in and out, framing the guest's words. There are a bunch of other formats we could do, but I think more interestingly, you can work in segments. So maybe there is a segment within the show where you are having a straight up interview. I am talking to you about X, Y, and Z. But then maybe later on, we're doing a rapid fire round where it's just you talking about the 5 movies that you love in your B2B area. Who knows? I'm really just making this up. But I think segments are where you can get really creative and where you can have some fun with branding and for clipping because you can clip specific segments for YouTube. And then within those segments, you can create clips, and all of those things might be exciting and might be something that a peer sees on LinkedIn and says, oh, I want to talk about my 5 favorite B2B movie clips and I want to be on that show. And then a few years from then, they want to be a sponsor. So I think it's all about making cool stuff and making enough stuff that it hits the right people at the right time. And you can only do that if you really experiment.
Let me change the focus just a little bit to podcast conferences or events. We've both seen each other at multiple conferences. I tend to go to Podfest Expo and Podcast Movement and then some local events. Are there 2 or 3 or 4 that are either your favorites or that you would recommend that podcasters attend?
Yeah, I love Podcast Movement. We've definitely met at that a few times. That's the first event that I ever went to in 2017. And I've gone to almost every one since then. I just think it's a great schmooze fest. And it takes a while to figure out your place at this, especially if it's your first time going. The first time I went, I had no idea who anyone was, no idea. People didn't know who I was, and I really just went around and shook hands with every single booth and like probably was a little overeager, but it worked out. And I think a lot of people hold back from going to these conferences because they when you do go, you want to make sure that you're getting your a bang for your buck. And a lot of time that means like schmoozing more than you feel comfortable, and that's hard. So I have a few tactics that I've used over the years for getting a lot out of it when it comes to staying at the happy hours and all of the parties, and even when you're at the expo hall, shaking hands and making conversation and things like that. I think those are great. This goes for any sort of conference, but Podcast Movement is great because it's big. It's a really fun, diverse grouping of people from the business side of things all the way down to indie creators who just heard the word podcast yesterday and are getting started soon. I also really like the podcast show in London for a similar reason. It's also very big and very lively. And the events there are awesome because the expo hall is in the center of everything, and surrounding it are the learning sessions, which are always packed. And the energy that you feel when the sessions are always packed is just great. And it's right in the middle of London. So there are a lot of restaurants nearby. There's a lot of events that take place nearby right after, rather than having to get on a bus or getting on a other sort of public transportation in order to get to the next thing. And that's great because it kind of eliminates the barrier of, oh, I'll just go back to my hotel room for a bit and then you're done for the day. So I like that. Also, in terms of just staying out and schmoozing. And then I just attended On Air Fest, which is a festival in Brooklyn. It's more of a crafty festival, a celebration of the art of audio, but there are elements of learning how to make things. They're making more of an effort of that to have sessions like that. And that's just a really great event. It's beautiful. It's really well curated, and it looks good. It smells good. The food is good, all that kind of stuff.
I can't believe I didn't see you.
Where?
On Airfest.
You were there?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So sad.
My daughter moved to Brooklyn last summer, so it gave me an
Oh,
excuse
you
to go
did tell
see
me
her.
that. So cool.
As we move towards the end of this recording, not episode, are there maybe 2 or 3 suggestions you would give to podcasters, or trends you're seeing that you think we should at least study over the next couple of years regarding podcasting?
I think, yes. In this day and age, I think a lot of people expect the answer to be video, and like you must have video or you must have an opinion on video. And truthfully, I wouldn't focus on video or not. I would focus on making, like I said this a few times, but I'll call it out that I said it a few times, high value, genuinely helpful, short clips of content. I don't really love the word content, but that's what this is, for the demographics that you want to be in touch with. And those can be audio, those can be video, those can be text only, they can be static image with a caption. But I don't think it's about the delivery. I don't think it's about how they're being delivered. I think it's about trying all of those different things, because different people within your target demographic like to receive content in different ways. And I would just shy away from the advice out there that says you must do video. I think it's more like you must put out good stuff to anybody who might possibly want it.
I love it. I love it. Arielle, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you or find out more about Audily or what you have going on, what might be the best place or places for them to go.
Thank you for asking. ArielleNissenblatt.com is my website. For Audily stuff, for the Pinwheel division, it's pinwheelpods.com. And I'm on LinkedIn, and that's where I'm most active writing about podcast and media related things.
Arielle, thanks again for taking the time to visit with me. It's been a ton of fun. I hope we can continue this conversation.
So much fun. Thank you for having me and for the visit.